everyone knows the name, Jack the Ripper. It is perhaps the most famous name in the history of murder. But here is the part almost no one knows. He probably never wrote it. The most famous killer who ever lived may have been named by a journalist who never saw his face. The monster, in part, was made of newsprint. In the autumn of 1888, 5 women were murdered in the streets of one small district of London. 10 weeks of terror. A piece of a human kidney mailed to a frightened man in the post. A message scrawled on a wall and wiped away at dawn by the police themselves. And a killer who was never caught, never named, never seen. This is the case that created the modern monster. Stay with me. To understand what happened, you have to stand in Whitechapel, the East End of London, 1888. It was the dark heart of the richest city on earth, and it was a place the rich tried very hard not to think about. Writers of the day called it the abyss. Tens of thousands of human beings were packed into rotting tenements and common lodging houses, where for a few pennies you could rent a coffin-sized bed in a room full of strangers, or, if you were truly desperate, a length of rope to lean on through the night. The streets were so narrow, the gaslight barely reached the ground. There was hunger here, and gin and disease, and a kind of poverty that the comfortable west of the city refused to believe still existed in the heart of the empire. It was overcrowded, filthy, and largely beyond the reach of the law. Whole families lived in a single room. Children worked or starved. And into this maze of black courts and blind alleys, where a scream was just one more sound in the night, a killer could step, do his work, and vanish, all in the space of a few minutes. And in this place lived the women who would become his victims. For more than a century, they have been reduced to 3 words: prostitutes in Whitechapel. But they were far more than that, and recent research suggests that some of them may not have been soliciting at all. They were daughters and mothers and wives. They had been domestic servants, or married to printers and blacksmiths, or had sung in the pubs before drink, or the death of a child, or a marriage gone wrong, dragged them down into the lodging houses. When they had the few coins for a bed, they took one. When they did not, they walked the streets through the night, simply to stay awake and stay alive. It was on those nights, with nowhere to lie down, that the killer found them. It began in the cold early hours of August 31st, 1888. A carman walking to work in the dark almost stumbled over a woman lying in the entrance to a stable yard on Buck's Row. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols. She was 43 years old, and the people who knew her called her Polly. A few hours earlier, she had been turned away from her lodging house because she did not have her 4pence for a bed. Her last recorded words, spoken with a laugh, were that she would soon get the money. Look at the jolly bonnet she was wearing now. By the time the carman found her, her throat had been cut. Twice, so deeply that the wounds had nearly severed her head from her body. Only later, at the mortuary, did anyone see the rest. She had been cut open across the abdomen. It was a savagery the police had almost no language for. And the police, it must be understood, had almost nothing else either. This was 1888. There were no fingerprints in use, no blood typing, no forensic science as we would recognize it, no cameras at the scene, no useful street lighting in those courts, and no centralized way to connect one crime to another. Detection meant knocking on doors and asking questions. So at first, even with Mary Ann Nichols dead, no one understood what they were truly facing. Women died in the East End. The police searched for the ordinary answers: a violent husband, a robbery, a drunken quarrel, and found nothing that fit. And while they searched, the killer was already choosing the next. 8 days later, on the 8th of September, it happened again, and this time it was worse. Annie Chapman, 47 years old, was found in the backyard of a house on Hanbury Street, in the gray light of morning, with people sleeping just a few feet away on the other side of the wall. Her throat was cut in the same way. But this time, the killer had stayed longer and done more. He had opened her body and removed organs from inside her, carrying part of her away with him into the dark. And now the police understood something that turned their stomachs. This was not blind rage. This was not robbery. Whoever did this worked quickly, in near silence, in almost total darkness, and he seemed to know exactly where to cut. For the first time, there was talk of a man with anatomical knowledge, a doctor, a surgeon, a butcher, or a slaughterman, a monster who understood the human body. The newspapers seized the story, and they didn't let go. London had never seen anything like it, and neither had the press. This was a new kind of crime for a new kind of media age. The city held more than 1 million newly literate readers, with cheap halfpenny papers sold on every corner, all of them fighting for the same hungry audience. Papers like The Star built their circulation on the murders. Rumor became headline within hours. An early suspect, a local leather worker the streets called Leather Apron, was hunted by frightened mobs until the police arrested a man named John Pizer and cleared him completely. It didn't matter. The fear had its own engine now. The East End wanted a face to put on the darkness, and the press was only too happy to sell it one. Then, on the 27th of September, a letter arrived at the Central News Agency. It was written in red ink, taunting, gleeful, almost playful, and it promised more. It mocked the police for their failure. It called the killing of women his work, his trade, and it was signed with a name that no one had ever heard before. Yours truly, Jack the Ripper. A few days later, a postcard followed in the same hand, bragging about a double event, written, it claimed, before the news had even broken. The name was electric. It was perfect. It took a faceless, shapeless terror and gave it a character, a swagger, almost a brand. Within days, those 3 words were on the lips of the entire English-speaking world. And here is the uncomfortable truth at the very center of this case. Most serious experts now believe that letter was a hoax. They believe it was written not by the killer, but by a journalist looking to keep a sensational and profitable story alive and sell more papers. The police of the day themselves came to suspect a particular reporter. If they are right, then the most famous murderer in human history was christened by a man at a writing desk who simply wanted a better headline. The legend and the man may never have met. For 140 years, the world has been chasing a name that the killer himself may never once have spoken. The hunt, by now, was the largest London had ever mounted. The man leading much of it on the ground was Inspector Frederick Aberline, a quiet, careful detective who knew Whitechapel and its people better than almost anyone in the force. His men went house to house, knocking on thousands of doors across the district. They questioned butchers, sailors, and slaughtermen, anyone whose trade or whose blood-stained clothes might fit the theory of a man with a knife and a knowledge of anatomy. Plainclothes officers walked the alleys at night, hoping to be mistaken for a victim. The streets filled with private vigilance committees, ordinary working men patrolling in the dark because they no longer trusted the police to protect their wives and daughters. And still, in a district so crowded you could not walk 10 paces without passing another human being. The killer moved through all of it, again and again, completely unseen. Then, on the night of the 30th of September, he answered all that effort and all that fear in the most terrible way possible. He killed twice in one night. First came Elizabeth Stride, 44 years old, found in a yard off Burner Street, her throat cut, but her body otherwise untouched. Almost everyone who studies the case believes the killer was interrupted here, disturbed by a pony and cart turning into the narrow yard, and that he was forced to slip away into the shadows with his work unfinished and his appetite unsatisfied. Because less than an hour later, and less than a mile away, he found Catherine Eddowes in the dark corner of Mitre Square. Eddowes, 46, had been released from a police cell only a short time before, where she had been held simply for being drunk. She sobered up, gave a false name, and was led out into the night, straight into the path of the most dangerous man in London. What he did to her in the few minutes he had, in an open public square, with a constable passing through on his beat every quarter of an hour, is almost beyond belief. He cut her throat, mutilated her face, and removed her uterus and her left kidney, carrying them away into the dark. The press named it the double event, and the city tipped over from fear into something close to hysteria. And on that same night, the killer may have left behind the only words he ever truly wrote. Not far from Mitre Square, in a doorway on Goulston Street, a constable found a torn piece of bloodied apron, cut from Catherine Eddowes, and dropped by the fleeing killer as he wiped his hands or his blade. And on the dark brick wall directly above it, written in chalk, was a strange message. The exact wording is disputed to this day, but it ran roughly: "The Jews are the men that will not be blamed for nothing." Was it written by the killer, pointing a finger, or covering his tracks? Was it simply old graffiti that happened to be there, above an unrelated scrap of cloth? No one would ever get the chance to study it properly. As dawn approached and the Sunday market crowds began to gather, the head of the entire London Metropolitan Police, Commissioner Sir Charles Warren, came to Goulston Street in person, and he gave an order. He had the writing washed off the wall before it could even be properly photographed. He feared that those words about the Jewish community in a district already boiling with suspicion and rumor could ignite riots. Perhaps he was right to be afraid, but in that single decision, he may have destroyed the most direct clue the killer ever left. It was gone before the morning was out. 2 weeks later came the artifact that no one who studies this case ever forgets. On the 16th of October, a man named George Lusk, the chairman of a local committee of citizens who had banded together to patrol the streets themselves, opened a small parcel that had arrived in the ordinary post. Inside was half of a human kidney, preserved in spirits of wine. With it came a letter, badly spelled, scrawled and stained, almost deranged in its triumph. It began with 2 words that have echoed for over a century: "From hell." The writer claimed that he had fried and eaten the other half of the kidney, and that it was very nice, and he dared Lusk to catch him if he could. A doctor who examined the organ believed it could indeed have come from a human being, perhaps a woman who drank heavily, perhaps dead, about as long as Catherine Eddowes. Was it real? Was it the killer himself, taunting the very men hunting him through the dark? Or was it a grotesque prank by a medical student with easy access to a dissecting room? Like almost everything in this case, the answer slipped away into the fog and was never recovered. By now, all of London and much of the world was watching Whitechapel. The pressure on the police became crushing. Queen Victoria herself wrote demanding that something be done. There was serious talk of bringing in bloodhounds to track the killer through the streets, and a test was actually run in a London park. Rewards were posted. Hundreds of men were stopped, questioned, and released. Letters poured into the newspapers and the police by the thousand, almost every one of them a hoax, and each one had to be read and considered, swallowing the time of exhausted men. And under all of that weight, Commissioner Sir Charles Warren resigned. The most powerful police force on Earth, in the very heart of its own capital, was being made to look helpless by a single man it could not even see. Then came the 9th of November, 1888, and the worst of it. For the first time, the killer found his victim indoors. Mary Jane Kelly was the youngest of the Canonical Five, only around 25 years old. And unlike the others, she had a small rented room of her own, a single ground floor room at Miller's Court. Behind a locked door, with the curtains drawn across a broken window, with all the time in the world, and no fear of being interrupted or seen, the killer did things that the officers who finally broke in that morning could barely bring themselves to record in their notebooks. It was, by a great distance, the most extreme of all the murders. A young woman, destroyed in the one place in the world where she should have been safe. And it was the last. After Mary Jane Kelly, the canonical killings simply stopped. There was no final letter that anyone could trust, no deathbed confession, no arrest that held. The murders that had gripped the entire world for 10 weeks. Of autumn ended as abruptly and as silently as they had begun. The killer did not build toward some even greater horror. He did not, in the end, make the one fatal mistake that would have caught him. He simply vanished from the streets of Whitechapel as completely as if he had never existed at all. And that silence is its own kind of mystery. Why would a man like that, growing bolder and more savage with every kill, suddenly stop? The honest answer is that no one knows, and every theory is only a guess. Perhaps he died, soon after Kelly, by his own hand or some other. Perhaps he was locked away in a prison or a lunatic asylum for some entirely different offense, his connection to the murders never suspected. Perhaps he simply left, boarded a ship, and carried whatever lived inside him to another city, another country, where the killings began again under a different name. Each of those possibilities points toward a different suspect. And so the argument began, and it has never ended. Because in the years since, more suspects have been named for these 5 murders than for any crime in human history. There was Montague John Druitt, a barrister and schoolteacher who drowned himself in the River Thames just weeks after the final murder, his coat pockets filled with stones. His suicide and its timing made him a suspect in the private notes of a senior policeman of the day, even though almost no hard evidence ties him to Whitechapel at all. There was Aaron Kosminski, a poor Polish-Jewish barber who lived in the very heart of the murder district, who suffered from severe mental illness, and who was later committed to an asylum where he eventually died. A senior detective named him, decades afterward, as a strong suspect, claiming he had been identified by a witness who then refused to give evidence against a fellow Jew. There was Francis Tumblety, an American quack doctor with a documented hatred of women, who was arrested in London at the time, jumped bail, and fled the country soon after the murders ended. And then there are the wilder theories, the ones the legend loves best, that the killer was a member of the royal family, or a royal physician named Sir William Gull, silencing women in some grand Masonic conspiracy, a story with almost no evidence and a great deal of romance. That a diary surfaced supposedly written by a Liverpool cotton merchant named James Maybrick, confessing to it all, a document most experts regard as a modern forgery. Painters, midwives, princes, and poets have all been accused. Whole libraries have been filled. And not one single theory in 140 years has ever truly been proven. In recent years, one name has come back again and again. Aaron Kosminski. A team of researchers claimed to have tested DNA recovered from a silk shawl said to have been found beside the body of Catherine Eddowes, and they announced that it pointed to him. For a moment, the headlines around the world declared the case finally closed, solved after more than a century. But the science did not hold up. The kind of DNA they tested, the kind passed down the maternal line, is shared by enormous numbers of unrelated people and can really only be used to rule a person out, not to prove that they are guilty. And worse, there is no solid evidence that the shawl was ever at the murder scene at all, or that it had ever belonged to Catherine Eddowes. It had passed through many hands over more than 100 years. The case for Kosminski, like every confident case before it, dissolved the moment it was examined closely. The file is still open. It has never been anything but open. So here is what the Ripper really left behind. Not a body count that was large by the standards of the killers who came after him. 5 women. But he was the first. The first murderer of the age of mass newspapers. The first to be turned in real time by a hungry and competitive press into a character, a brand, a monster, with a name that fit perfectly across the top of a front page, sold to millions of readers who would never set foot in Whitechapel and would never once learn the names of the women who died there. We remember Jack the Ripper not only because of what he did, but because of what the world did with him. We built the legend together, out of fear and ink, and a name that a journalist may simply have made up. And in all of it, in all the books and the films, and the late-night walking tours, the women themselves have been nearly erased, reduced to a single grim category, forgotten as people. So before we go, we remember them, not the killer. Them. Ann Nichols, 43 years old. Annie Chapman, 47 years old. Elizabeth Stride, 44 years old. Catherine Eddowes, 46 years old. Mary Jane Kelly, around 25 years old. They were poor. They were struggling. They had names and histories, and people who had once loved them and called them home. They lived in Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888, and they were never given justice. But they will not be forgotten. We say their names. We will not forget them.